NATO stands on the brink of war with Russia, and the first shots could be fired far sooner than anticipated. Perhaps even as early as 2026. That's according to Germany's defense minister, Boris Pistorius, who recently revealed that large parts of Europe may just have experienced their last summer of peace for quite some time. It's a frightening prospect, but one that European nations and the entire NATO alliance need to take seriously if they want to be ready for whatever Russia has in store for them. Pistorius made his remarks during an interview with German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung FAZ on November the 15th in honor of the German Armed Forces' 70th anniversary. The interview initially touched on the state of the German Armed Forces and Pistorius' time in office so far, but the topic of discussion swiftly turned to Vladimir Putin and the war in Ukraine. After the interview asked Pistorius whether or not the German government was acting fast enough to counter emerging threats, the minister had this to say: "Putin makes no secret of his imperial fantasies, in which our freedom and our order, as we know them, have no meaning. We must respond quickly and decisively to this threat by strengthening our defense capabilities. There is much to be done. Armed forces have been neglected for decades. The infrastructure is partly dilapidated, and personnel numbers have been drastically reduced. In my view, the parties of the Democratic Center have internalized the need for decisive action. We are all pulling together on this. We have jointly changed course in recent years. But the truth is also this: we must become even faster in everything we do." This response echoes multiple claims from numerous officials across Europe and the NATO alliance, including NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte, who has repeatedly urged NATO nations to up the ante when it comes to defense spending and military modernization, as well as the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who has on several occasions expressed concerns that at least some members of the alliance aren't moving swiftly enough to prepare themselves for a possible Russian invasion. In February of this year, for example, Zelensky pulled no punches in his assessment of Europe's military preparedness, stating in terms of troop strength, the number of combat troops, the fleet, the air force, the drones, I honestly think that Europe is weak today. Several months later, he sounded the alarm about a potential Russian invasion by 2030. We believe that starting from 2030, Putin can have significantly greater capabilities. Today, Ukraine is holding him up. He has no time to drill the army. More recently, in late September, Zelensky reiterated his belief that Putin has plans far beyond Ukraine, telling the UN's General Assembly in New York that the Russian president will keep driving the war forward, wider and deeper, unless he is stopped. Rutte agrees, stating quite clearly in a speech at Chatham House in London earlier this year that Russia could be ready to strike NATO nations at some stage in the coming years. In terms of ammunition, Russia produces in 3 months what the whole of NATO produces in a year, and its defense industrial base is expected to roll out 1,500 tanks, 3,000 armored vehicles, and 200 Iskander missiles this year alone. Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years. Let's not kid ourselves, we are all on the eastern flank now. The new generation of Russian missiles travel at many times the speed of sound. The distance between European capitals is only a matter of minutes. There is no longer east or west. There is just NATO. Unfortunately, it now seems that the prospect of a 2030 Russian invasion was somewhat optimistic, as Pistorius, citing other officials and military historians, now says it could come much sooner when asked whether or not Germany has enough time to build up its defenses and modernize its military before Putin strikes. The defense minister responded, "The question remains speculative. Military experts and intelligence services can roughly estimate when Russia will have rebuilt its armed forces to the point where it would be capable of launching an attack on a NATO member state in the east. We have always said that this could be the case from 2029 onwards. Now, however, there are others who say this is conceivable as early as 2028, and some military historians even believe we already had our last summer of peace." The timeline between today and whenever Russia decides to invade keeps on getting shorter and shorter, and Pistorius wasn't the only high-profile political figure to make a claim of this kind in recent days. On November the 17th, while speaking at a conference in Vilnius, the capital city of Lithuania, European Commissioner for Defense Andrius Kubilius claimed that numerous EU intelligence services now feel that Russia could be ready to test NATO's strength significantly sooner than 2030. One of the most important questions for the European Union and for NATO is how to defend the Baltic states and how to learn from Ukraine The urgency of the first question comes from the public statements of our intelligence services, including from Germany, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, and from our region, that Putin can be ready to test Article 5 during the next 2 or 4 years. Before 2030, Kubilius has made similar claims before. Back in May of this year, he was asked quite clearly by an interviewer when he expects Russia to attack the European Union. Responding on this issue, I pay attention to what the intelligence services say, not politicians. The intelligence services in Germany, Denmark, and others are saying that Russia could be ready to attack us, or as they call it, to test Article 5 before 2030. Some believe it could happen even sooner, within the next 3 years. The reason for this is clear. Russia's economy has switched to a war economy and is producing a lot of weapons. At the same time, and this is even more important, it is no longer possible to simply return the economy to its previous state. So if peace or a ceasefire is established in Ukraine, Russia will continue to produce and accumulate such an amount of weapons that will eventually allow it to launch a new aggression. In his latest remarks, Kubilius went on to note that the most likely targets of Putin's aggression are the 3 Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. He added, however, that no matter which specific nation Putin chooses to target, it will be an aggression also against all of NATO and against all of the European Union, and it's up to NATO and the EU to be ready to respond, if and when that moment comes. Fortunately, many nations are rising to the occasion, upping their defense spending and taking bold, significant steps to modernize their militaries, upgrade their arsenals, and bolster their border defenses in preparation for what's to come. Some are still lagging behind, but others are setting the right kinds of examples, like Poland, which leads the way in not just European, but NATO defense spending, dedicating a whopping 4.7% of its GDP to military investments in 2025. Germany, too, is taking on a leadership role in this domain and has done so since the very early stages of the Russian-Ukraine war. Indeed, it was only days after the invasion began that the German Chancellor at the time, Olaf Scholz, announced that Germany would dramatically increase its spending to over 2% of GDP, telling the Bundestag, "We will have to invest more in the security of our country to protect our freedom and democracy." Prior to that point, Germany had effectively resisted calls from countries like the United States and other NATO nations to increase its defense spending, with the country investing just 1.5% of its GDP on defense. Back in 2021, this was due to a combination of factors, including strong anti-militarist and pro-pacifist stances among the German population and long-held beliefs that Russia would never attack NATO, and that the era of large-scale ground wars on European soil had been confined to the history books. Putin's illegal invasion changed all that, and Germany had to either adapt or face the increasingly credible threat of invasion and even annihilation, so as well as spending much more, with plans to invest approximately 3.5% of German GDP into defense by 2029. Germany's leaders have also made significant structural changes and overdue upgrades to the country's military forces. Historians himself announced these changes in April 2024, first revealing that the Bundeswehr, or German armed forces, would change from having 2 separate military command centers, one for planning and running deployments abroad, the other handling defense of Germany itself, to having just one unified operational military command to enable faster decisions and greater efficiency. He also announced that the Bundeswehr's cyber and information department would officially evolve into a fully fleshed 4th branch of the armed forces, alongside the Army, Navy, and Air Force, a clear sign of Germany's understanding of the growing risks related to electronic warfare, cybersecurity, and hybrid threats. Germany has also made waves in terms of production and procurement. Its biggest defense company, and the 5th largest in all of Europe, Rheinmetall, received an €8.5 billion, $9.8 billion contract to deliver 155mm artillery shells to the country's armed forces, with deliveries commencing in 2025. And Germany's leaders have been looking into buying additional main battle tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and helicopters too. Only days ago, Berlin also signed off on a new national military service plan in order to boost the numbers of active duty troops in its armed forces. The new scheme will mandate all German men aged 18 and above to fill out a questionnaire regarding their suitability to serve, with military screenings also set to start from 2027. This should play a massive part in Germany's quest to assemble the strongest conventional army in all of Europe, with Rheinmetall boss Armin Papagear telling the BBC he feels that this target is achievable by 2029. It's an ambitious plan, but Germany may not have the 4 years it needs to achieve its lofty goals. With Putin potentially plotting his invasion for 2028, 2027, or possibly even 2026. Fortunately, Pistorius remains confident that even if a Russian attack comes sooner, rather than later, Germany is still in a relatively strong position to defend itself and assist in the defense of other NATO nations. The Bundeswehr is in a significantly better shape than is sometimes suggested by media reports. And above all, the armed forces are considerably better equipped than they were a few years ago. We are on track. We are picking up speed. For example, we have concluded far more contracts for weapon systems than previous years. We have a clear plan for increasing personnel and infrastructure. And even before the new conscription system comes into effect, the number of applications and recruits is rising. This is already having a noticeable effect within the ranks. And yes, we're not yet where we want to be. But we are well on our way, and we have ambitious plans. Commenting on NATO as a whole, he stated, "We shouldn't give the impression that NATO cannot defend itself. It has considerable deterrent potential. Conventional, but of course also nuclear. Regardless, we have combat-ready armed forces. But yes, we need to equip them even better." This was a familiar theme throughout Pistorius's interview. He repeatedly acknowledged that NATO nations are, at the very least, ready and able to defend themselves from Putin's attacks, while also noting that the alliance still has some way to go, and needs to accelerate as much as it can to place itself in the best possible position if and when a Russian invasion occurs. He highlighted the importance of rapid, efficient, and strategic procurement while calling on individual defense sector firms to play their part in speeding up military modernization across the board. The crucial point is that we are reliable in our procurement. Over the long term, we have created the prerequisite for this, with a sectoral exemption and a clear commitment to our defense spending. Furthermore, we are creating better conditions for the expansion of the security and defense industry in Germany. The law to accelerate planning and procurement also plays an important role in this. It is also expected to be passed by Parliament this year, but it's also clear companies themselves must become even faster in setting up and expanding production. There's no doubt that speed is of the essence. Even if experts' predictions are off by a couple of years and Russia doesn't attack until 2029 or 2030, that still leaves precious little time for countries across the European continent to prepare themselves for what is to come. While the Russian army has struggled to make the kinds of gains Vladimir Putin would have wanted, and has also suffered enormous losses, there's no denying that it has also inflicted enormous damage, destruction, and chaos across Ukraine, with reports of more than 50,000 civilian casualties over the course of the war so far, combined with about 400,000 of military casualties. Even if Russia has little overall chance of emerging victorious in any sort of direct conflict with NATO, it still has the power to deal vast amounts of devastation, with colossal loss of life, a very real prospect for any countries in the Kremlin's sights. The more those countries can prepare themselves today, the more lives they can save, if and when the war comes to their doorstep. And while Germany itself is unlikely to be in the firing lines right away, Russia could potentially have plans to attack the Baltics, or even Poland, before potentially pushing further westwards. What's more, given the fact that Russia's armed forces now rely so heavily on aerial attacks using long-range missiles and massive drone swarms, it may not necessarily need to solely target the countries closest to it. It could easily launch missile salvos at targets hundreds of miles away, including the major cities and capitals of Western Europe. As we saw back in September, when a small number of Russian drones crossed into Polish airspace, NATO nations don't yet appear to be fully prepared to counteract this particular kind of warfare. Poland and several allies scrambled fighter jets upon detecting the Russian UAVs, but are only able to take out 4 of them. Ukraine, meanwhile, regularly downs hundreds of the Kremlin's drones in the span of a single night, relies on its world-leading defense complex to help its cities and vital infrastructure withstand record-breaking Russian swarms. This is clearly an area in which Europe needs to improve, because if and when a Russian attack does begin, there's no doubt that the Kremlin will be counting on its ever-expanding and rapidly evolving drone army to deal large parts of the initial damages. Countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and others will have to upgrade their defenses in order to respond much more rapidly and efficiently, and there's much more that they can learn from Ukraine in this regard, as Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen recently commented at the European Political Community Summit in Copenhagen, the only expert right now in the world when it comes to anti-drone capacities is Ukraine, because they are fighting the Russian drones almost every day. We need to take all the experiences, all the new technology, all the innovation from Ukraine and incorporate it into our own rearmament. Pastorius, too, touched on the topic of drones during his interview with Faz, noting their growing importance in modern warfare and highlighting Germany's efforts to fuel faster innovation in this sector. The war in Ukraine demonstrates the enormous importance of drones in modern warfare. Nevertheless, heavy equipment will continue to play a crucial role. Military experts tell us that future warfare will be a combined arms war involving howitzers, tanks and aircraft, as well as cyberspace, and of course, unmanned aerial systems. In drone development, we are currently experiencing increasingly shorter innovation cycles. Within 2 to 3 months, the technology changes dramatically, including in drone defense. Therefore, it would make no sense for us to stockpile billions of euros worth of drones today that will be obsolete the day after tomorrow. Instead, we will pursue new procurement methods. We will develop them ourselves, bringing users and developers together right from the start. Together with companies, we will ensure that the state-of-the-art variants can be rapidly mass-produced in the event of a defense scenario. Other countries will be wise to follow the German example. Drone technology is evolving at a remarkably rapid rate, with Ukraine continuously refining its designs and unveiling newer, more advanced and capable unmanned aerial and surface vehicles to carry out its frontline assaults and deep strike operations against Russian assets. Even as soon as a year from now, the kind of drones buzzing above the skies of Donetsk and Russian regions may be very different from those we see today, especially as engineers work out ways to integrate emerging technologies like artificial intelligence into their drone designs. Countries across Europe need to do everything in their power to first catch up with the likes of Russia and Ukraine in regard to drone development, and perhaps even overtake Russia by making more advanced, efficient, and effective units that could be used for various purposes, like reconnaissance, interception, and aerial assaults, if a war ever breaks out. But it's not just in drones that countries like Germany are trying to get ahead of the game. When asked how he sees the German armed forces looking by 2030, Pastorius was hopeful, setting several clear targets, both for Germany and the NATO alliance. Our plan for 2030 is a reserve of more than 200,000 soldiers. Our active duty forces will have grown to between 210,000 and 220,000. We will have accelerated our procurement processes even further. New F-35 fighter jets and Chinook helicopters will be flying, and the Army will be using Leopard 2, I-8 and Sky Ranger systems. A fully deployed Lithuanian brigade will already have been stationed on NATO's eastern flank for several years. I'm convinced that this will be a model project, setting an example for other units. At the same time, I hope that we in NATO will maintain the unity we still enjoy today, and those who are 18 today will look back with pride on their military service for our country. Numerous other countries have similarly ambitious plans for 2030 or beyond, but with more and more experts sounding the alarm about a Russian invasion as early as next year, many may want to rethink their tactics and focus on their most pressing priorities in the months to come, before it's too late. In fact, there are some experts arguing that war with Russia has, in effect, already begun. You can learn more about that in this video, which explores how the Kremlin is using drones, psychological tactics, sabotage, and information warfare to weaken Europe before the first shots are fired. Or check out this video to learn more about how Germany is gearing up for a conflict with the Kremlin, delving into the details of Berlin's military modernization plans. Remember to subscribe to our channel too, so you can stay informed and aware of all the latest breaking news, military reports, and expert assessments of the war in Ukraine and other important conflicts across the globe.